Amaris Caldwell stood frozen at an upscale destination wedding, a tear streaming down her cheek as she clamped a hand over her mouth in sheer terror, watching a man smile warmly at his beautiful new wife and young daughter. But what the celebrating crowd didn't know was that the man sitting rows away in the tailored charcoal suit was Amaris's husband, Baek Do-hyun, and he was a powerful mafia boss who supposedly died in a fiery car crash 3 years ago. Before this day ends, Amaris is going to discover something that will shatter her reality forever. The chilling realization that her 3 years of agonizing grief were built on a meticulously crafted lie. But to understand why a ruthless syndicate leader would fake his own death and abandon his loyal wife to face his enemies alone, we need to go back to the wreckage of that fiery crash, and the moment Amaris unknowingly took her first step toward cold, calculated vengeance. The manicured lawns and twinkling string lights of the coastal venue blurred into a sickening smear of color as Amaris pushed her way blindly through the celebrating crowd. Her lungs burned, fighting for air that suddenly felt too thin to sustain her. The emerald green silk of her wrap dress, a garment she had carefully chosen just hours ago to make herself feel beautiful and invincible again, now felt like a heavy, suffocating shroud dragging her toward the earth. She stumbled past the valet stand, her heels striking the cobblestone driveway with a frantic, echoing rhythm, until she reached the shadowed sanctuary of the empty parking lot. There, leaning heavily against the cool metal of an unfamiliar car, she finally let the oxygen tear into her throat. She clamped her trembling hands over her ears, desperately trying to drown out the distant, joyful sound of the wedding string quartet. But the music was already being swallowed by a much louder, much older nightmare. The deafening roar of twisting metal and the concussive boom of an explosion violently hijacked her senses. 3 years. For 3 agonizing years, the phantom scent of expensive cologne and burning gasoline had haunted her every waking moment. The memory of the crash site hit her tonight with the same brutal, unrelenting force it had on that rainy November night. She remembered the blinding red and blue flashes of the emergency vehicles illuminating the charred, unrecognizable husk of Baek Do-hyun's luxury sedan. She remembered falling to her knees on the wet asphalt, the jagged gravel biting into her skin, her screams completely swallowed by the wailing sirens as she mourned the love of her life. But the true horror of her existence had not ended with his supposed funeral. It had only just begun. With the feared, untouchable mafia boss officially declared dead, the wolves had immediately descended upon his unprotected widow. The flashbacks crashed over her in a dark, suffocating wave, stealing the breath she had just caught. She saw the splintered wood of her front door the night the rival cartels violently kicked it in, demanding answers she didn't have about missing shipments and hidden ledgers. She felt the icy, unforgiving steel of a gun barrel pressed flush against her temple, while ruthless men tore her home apart, convinced she was hiding his vast fortune. They had frozen her bank accounts, seized their shared properties, and systematically stripped her of every ounce of protection Do-hyun had once promised her. Amaris had been left to navigate a deadly, bloodthirsty underworld entirely alone, jumping at shadows and fearing for her life every time a car idled outside her window. She had ultimately sold her wedding ring just to afford a bus ticket out of the city, eating scraps and living in absolute humiliating destitution, while the ghost of her husband remained untarnished and sacred in her heart. She had endured the unspeakable, all because she believed Do-hyun had been tragically ripped away from her by fate. Yet, just moments ago, she had seen him, breathing, smiling, holding the delicate hand of a child that was not hers. The sheer impossibility of the sight paralyzed her, But the longer she stood in the cool evening air, the more the paralyzing shock began to curdle into something sharp, cold, and deeply metallic. Amaris refused to believe her eyes had deceived her, writing off the encounter as a trick of her traumatized mind. The sharp line of his jaw, the arrogant, composed posture, the subtle indent of the scar near his left temple. It was the man she had loved with every fiber of her being, the man she had bled for and starved for. Retreating to her dim, inexpensive hotel room on the outskirts of the city, she securely deadbolted the door and immediately opened her laptop. Her hands were still shaking violently, but her mind, meticulously forged in the fires of survival over the past 3 years, was already shifting gears. She was no longer a helpless, grieving widow. She was a woman who had spent 1,000 nights learning how to hide from monsters, which meant she also knew exactly how to track them. Drawing on the deep, perilous knowledge she had quietly acquired during her marriage to a syndicate boss, Amaris began to dig through the digital shadows. She bypassed the surface web entirely, utilizing encrypted channels and old, untraceable aliases she had memorized but never dared to use while in hiding. It took hours of relentless, obsessive tracing of digital breadcrumbs. A newly registered holding company routed through the Cayman Islands, a series of masked real estate acquisitions in the Pacific Northwest, a high society photograph from a private charity gala, before the phantom materialized into sharp, undeniable focus. Baek Do-hyun had not simply survived the wreckage, he had been spectacularly resurrected as a king. The heavily guarded documents glowing on her screen revealed a masterclass in deception. His new identity was immaculate, wiped entirely clean of any ties to the bloody, chaotic turf wars of his past. But it was the background of the woman in the blush-pink dress that finally snapped the last lingering thread of Amaris's loyalty. The radiant Asian woman sitting beside him at the wedding was not just a beautiful new lover. She was the sole heiress to the largest, most impenetrable rival crime syndicate in the hemisphere. The truth clicked into place with a sickening, heavy finality that made Amaris's stomach drop. Do-hyun had not faked his death to protect Amaris from an impending cartel war, as a desperate man might. He had faked his death to surrender to it, marrying directly into the enemy empire to secure an era of unprecedented power and absolute peace for himself. He had knowingly traded her life for a crown. She had been the necessary casualty, the perfect, expendable decoy left bleeding in the water to distract the sharks while he swam safely to a gilded shore. Staring at the harsh light of the glowing screen, the tear tracks on Amaris's cheeks finally dried, tightening her skin. The naive, loyal woman who had wept for Baek Do-hyun was officially dead. In her place sat someone far more dangerous, a survivor armed with the devastating truth, with absolutely nothing left to lose, and an entire empire to burn. The blue glow of the laptop screen illuminated the stark, unforgiving truth of her existence, casting long, hollow shadows across the peeling wallpaper of her cheap motel room. As Amaris scrolled endlessly through the decrypted files and encrypted ledgers she had painstakingly unearthed, the narrative of Baek Do-hyun's miraculous survival morphed into something infinitely more sinister. He had not faked his death to protect her from the dangerous crossfire of an impending syndicate war, as a desperate but loving man might. He had faked it specifically to discard her. During their marriage, Amaris had always known she was an anomaly in his world. A Black American woman thrust into the deeply traditional, insular, and often xenophobic hierarchy of the Korean underworld. While Do-hyun had publicly paraded her like a prized jewel, the elders and lieutenants of his organization had only ever viewed her as a glaring liability. She was a stain on his lineage, an outsider who compromised his alliances and actively prevented his ascension to absolute, undisputed power. To successfully merge his empire with the massive rival syndicate and marry their pure-blooded heiress, Do-hyun needed a completely clean slate. He needed Amaris permanently erased from the board. The fiery car crash on that rain-slicked highway had not been a tragic twist of fate or a desperate escape. It was a calculated, brutal amputation. The realization struck her with the physical force of a blow to the chest, stealing the air from her lungs. He had meticulously orchestrated his demise, knowing exactly what the violent vacuum of his absence would create. He knew his enemies would immediately swarm his vulnerable, unprotected widow, ripping her life apart to find the phantom millions he had already quietly smuggled offshore. He had deliberately left her behind as bait. While Amaris was enduring the terror of guns pressed to her temple, surviving brutal interrogations by ruthless cartels, and selling her wedding ring just to buy a bus ticket out of the city, Do-hyun had been sipping champagne on a private jet, flying toward his beautiful new bride. He had used her as a human shield, bleeding her out in the treacherous waters of the underworld so the predators would gorge on her misery while he swam safely to his gilded new shore. The profound cruelty of his calculation was breathtaking. The lingering, pathetic hope she had harbored, the desperate prayer that he had been forced into hiding to protect her, evaporated into the stagnant air of the motel room. The man she had loved was not a ghost. He was a monster who had worn the skin of a husband. In the heavy, suffocating silence that followed that epiphany, something fundamental broke inside Amaris, but it did not leave her weakened. The fragile, grieving widow who had cowered in the shadows for 3 years completely shattered, swept away by a rising, terrifying tide of cold, calculated rage. She stood up slowly, the violent trembling in her hands entirely gone. Walking into the cramped, flickering bathroom, she gripped the edges of the porcelain sink and stared into the cracked mirror. The woman looking back at her no longer had the wide, terrified eyes of a victim. Her gaze was hardened, obsidian, stripped of all mercy and brimming with an icy, predatory focus. A lesser woman might have chosen to run, to pack her meager belongings and disappear further into the map to preserve her fragile safety. An emotional, reckless woman might have stormed the wedding reception, screaming her truth to the crowd in a desperate bid for vindication, only to be quietly dragged away and permanently silenced by his new syndicate's security forces. Amaris would do neither. She would not grant him the satisfaction of her tears, nor the swift mercy of a sudden, chaotic confrontation. She was going to dismantle his meticulously constructed paradise brick by brick, and she was going to use the very tools he had foolishly left within her reach. During their marriage, Do-hyun had treated her as a beautiful, oblivious confidant, assuming she was too detached from his illicit operations to understand the fragmented conversations, the late-night phone calls, and the heavily guarded documents left carelessly on his mahogany desk. It was a fatal miscalculation. Amaris possessed a brilliant, observant mind, and over the years, she had quietly memorized the architecture of his empire. She knew the names of the shell companies, the passcodes to his hidden servers, and the deeply buried secrets he used to blackmail his highest-ranking captains. She knew where the bodies were buried because she had been the one to wash the blood from his cuffs. Her rage was no longer a wild, consuming fire. It was a sharpened blade, cooling in the forge. Do-hyun had built his unassailable new life on the foundational wealth he had stolen from his old one. If she severed the financial arteries that kept his new empire breathing, he would bleed out before the eyes of his new family, entirely powerless to stop it. He had left her destitute, and now Amaris was going to return the favor with apocalyptic interest. But a war of this magnitude could not be fought alone, and Amaris knew she was not the only casualty left in the wake of Baek Do-hyun's explosive deception. Using the last remnants of her hidden cash, she purchased an untraceable burner phone and a secure laptop, reaching out into the darkest, most dangerous corners of her past. She initiated contact with Marcus, Do-hyun's former logistics chief, a fiercely loyal man who had lost his own brother in the brutal cartel fallout that followed the staged crash. When Amaris finally met Marcus in the rain-slicked shadows of an abandoned shipyard, the shock on his scarred face at seeing her alive mirrored her own from the wedding. Once she laid out the undeniable proof of Do-hyun's survival and his treasonous alliance with the rival syndicate, Marcus's initial disbelief rapidly transformed into a violent, vengeful agreement. He had been left to manage a crumbling, bloody territory, bleeding for a king who had already secretly abdicated the throne. Through Marcus, she recruited Elena, a phantom of a forensic hacker whose career and life Do-hyun had maliciously destroyed to cover his digital tracks before vanishing. Bound by a shared, burning hatred for the man who had ruined them, this unlikely ghost council formed the ultimate arsenal. Working out of a subterranean server room stripped entirely off the grid, they launched their silent, devastating offensive. Amaris provided the memorized passcodes, the private Swiss routing numbers, and the aliases. Elena weaponized them. Within days, they breached the heavily encrypted walls of Do-hyun's hidden offshore accounts in the Caymans and the Seychelles. Sitting in the eerie glow of the monitors, Amaris watched with grim, intoxicating satisfaction as the stolen millions, the blood money that funded his pristine new life and kept his new heiress wife dripping in diamonds, were systematically siphoned away into untraceable, decentralized crypto wallets. They were draining his lifeblood, penny by illicit penny, until his sprawling war chest was entirely hollowed out. Yet, bankrupting him was merely the opening salvo. To truly destroy him, Amaris needed his new family to execute the sentence. Delving deep into the corrupted servers, she and her team exhumed the digital corpses Do-hyun had desperately tried to bury, gathering irrefutable proof of his past betrayals, the intercepted kill orders, and the undeniable evidence that Do-hyun had personally orchestrated the assassination of his new father-in-law's most trusted capos years prior. Amaris packaged the damning evidence into encrypted dossiers, her finger hovering over the keyboard, fully prepared to unleash the storm that would tear his false paradise to shreds. The assault on Baek Do-hyun's pristine new reality began not with a deafening explosion, but with a series of silent, suffocating fractures. Amaris did not want to kill him quickly. She wanted him to feel the exact agonizing helplessness he had so callously forced upon her 3 years ago. Working from the subterranean server room, she and Elena orchestrated a symphony of catastrophic financial sabotage that struck at the very heart of his legitimate business fronts. It started with the sprawling logistics empire he had built to launder the rival syndicate's blood money. Cargo ships carrying millions in untraceable luxury goods and narcotics were suddenly rerouted by phantom dispatchers, vanishing into international waters before arriving entirely emptied at port. Then came the high-end real estate shell companies. Highly sensitive escrow accounts, the lifeblood of his money laundering operations in the Pacific Northwest, were abruptly frozen by anonymous, flawlessly forged whistleblower complaints submitted to federal regulators. The millions he relied upon to prove his immense worth to his new, demanding father-in-law were suddenly bleeding out into the ether, leaving absolutely no digital fingerprints behind. Do-hyun's meticulously crafted facade of cool, untouchable composure finally began to splinter under the relentless, invisible pressure. Across the city, within the glass and steel fortress of his corporate headquarters, the panic began to set in. Amaris monitored his secure communications through the back doors Elena had violently pried open, listening with a dark, intoxicating thrill to the audio feeds of his corner office. She heard the sharp, uncharacteristic snap in his voice as he berated his bewildered lieutenants, the frantic rustle of paper ledgers being frantically reviewed, and the heavy, terrifying silence that followed when they realized the attacks were not random. The sabotage was far too precise, cutting deeply into operational arteries that only a high-ranking insider from his previous life could possibly know existed. Do-hyun quickly deduced that a dangerous ghost from his violently discarded past had somehow survived the bloody purge and was actively hunting him in the shadows. He doubled his heavily armed private security detail, obsessively swept his penthouses for listening devices, and grew increasingly paranoid of the rival cartel remnants. Yet, in all his frantic, arrogant calculations, his mind never once drifted to the destitute, grieving widow he had left to burn in the wreckage. To Do-hyun, Amaris had always been a fragile, oblivious casualty, entirely incapable of this level of sophisticated, apocalyptic ruin. He was bracing for a warlord, completely unaware that he was actually bleeding to death at the hands of the woman whose heart he had broken. As the anonymous attacks escalated, bleeding his offshore accounts dry and hopelessly disrupting his supply chains, the foundation of trust he had desperately built with his new, powerful in-laws began to dangerously erode, setting the perfect, chaotic stage for Amaris to finally step out of the digital shadows. He began drinking heavily during the day, the smooth whiskey doing nothing to quell the tremor in his hands. Every ringing phone, every delayed shipment, and every lingering glance from his new cartel associates felt like a tightening noose. Amaris watched his descent with glacial patience, knowing the true agony had only just begun. The inevitable collision happened on a rainy Tuesday evening, meticulously orchestrated by Amaris down to the second. Through relentless digital surveillance, she knew Do-hyun frequently sought refuge in the private, dimly lit VIP lounge of an exclusive downtown art gallery, seeking quiet away from his demanding new wife and his crumbling businesses. Amaris slipped into the venue, wearing a sleek black trench coat, her voluminous natural hair pinned back to avoid immediate recognition. She waited in the shadowed corridor leading to the private restrooms, her heart hammering a violent rhythm. When the heavy mahogany door swung open and Do-hyun stepped out, checking his encrypted phone with a furrowed brow, Amaris stepped directly into his path. The physical impact was slight, but the psychological shockwave was absolute. Do-hyun's head snapped up, the arrogant scowl freezing instantly on his face. The color drained completely from his sharp features, leaving him looking like a man who had just seen a ghost claw its way out of the grave. The phone nearly slipped from his grip as his terrified eyes locked onto hers. For a long, suffocating moment, the air between them turned to lead. Then, the seasoned manipulator in him instinctively kicked in, overriding the sheer horror of his exposure. He grabbed her arm, pulling her roughly into a secluded alcove away from the security cameras. "Amaris," he breathed, his voice a frantic whisper dripping with manufactured desperation. "My God, you're alive. You have no idea what I've been through." He reached up, trying to cradle her face with the same hands that had deliberately condemned her to absolute destitution. Amaris forced herself not to recoil, swallowing the bile rising in her throat. She played her part with terrifying perfection, letting her shoulders slump and allowing a single tear of feigned vulnerability to slip down her cheek. "Do-hyun," she choked out, her voice trembling with the fragile desperation he expected from a broken widow. "They told me you burned. They took everything. Why didn't you come for me?" He leaned in, his eyes swirling with a toxic cocktail of relief and deceit. "I had absolutely no choice," he lied smoothly, his thumb brushing away her tear. "The cartel was going to slaughter us both. I had to stage the crash to draw them off. I've been trapped in this new life, playing a dangerous game just to find a way back to you. I swear it." While he spun his sickening web of lies, convinced he had successfully pacified the naive woman he once owned, Amaris leaned heavily against his chest in a mock display of overwhelming relief. Beneath the protective folds of her trench coat, her steady hand slipped seamlessly into the tailored pocket of his charcoal suit jacket. With practiced precision, she dropped a microscopic, military-grade GPS tracker deep into the silk lining. "I was so lost without you," she whispered against his lapel, sealing his doom. Before he could trap her, she pulled away, wiping her eyes frantically. "I can't be seen with you. The men who hunted me might still be watching," she stammered, backing away into the shadows. Do-hyun nodded grimly, fully believing he had secured her silence. He watched her run, completely unaware that the broken bird he thought he had caged was actually the predator who now held his life in her hand. With the tracker firmly embedded in Do-hyun's suit and his movements completely compromised, Amaris escalated the war from the shadows directly into the heart of his new home. The brilliant, smiling Asian heiress who had sat beside him at the wedding was fiercely protective of her family's sprawling criminal empire, and Amaris knew that her loyalty to her bloodline would always eclipse her love for a husband who was failing to bring in revenue. Working late into the night alongside Elena, Amaris weaponized the ultimate betrayal. They bypassed the heavy firewalls of the rival syndicate's internal servers and securely deposited a highly encrypted dossier directly into the private inbox of Do-hyun's formidable father-in-law, simultaneously copying his blush-pink-wearing bride. The dossier contained no threats and no demands. It was simply a cold, irrefutable collection of financial ledgers, hidden bank routing numbers, and dates. It definitively proved that the millions of dollars hemorrhaging from the syndicate's logistics and real estate fronts over the past few weeks were not being lost to a phantom enemy, but were actively being embezzled and hidden in offshore accounts firmly controlled by Baek Do-hyun. The fallout within the syndicate's lavish, high-security compound was instantaneous and devastating. The trust Do-hyun had spent 3 bloody, deceptive years building evaporated overnight, replaced by a suffocating, lethal paranoia. His new wife, once a radiant portrait of marital bliss, turned into a beautiful, venomous interrogator. Through the audio bugs Elena had seamlessly piggybacked onto the tracker's signal, Amaris listened as the walls of his sprawling mansion closed in on him. She heard the sharp, stinging slap of flesh meeting flesh, followed by the heiress's icy, furious voice, demanding to know why his signature was on the shell companies draining her father's wealth. Do-hyun's smooth, manipulative tongue, which had so easily lied to Amaris in the gallery hallway, completely failed him under the crushing weight of the irrefutable evidence. He frantically denied the accusations, stammering that he was being set up by an unseen ghost, desperately trying to explain away the offshore accounts he had secretly built to eventually betray them, too. But in the ruthless, unforgiving world of syndicate politics, suspicion was a terminal disease, and the ledgers painted him as a parasitic traitor. Stripped of his financial leverage and entirely isolated within the heavily armed fortress he had married into, Do-hyun became a prisoner in his own gilded cage. His elite private security detail was quietly replaced by hardened enforcers, loyal only to his father-in-law. His access to the syndicate's deep operational funds was abruptly severed, leaving him entirely powerless to stop the bleeding. The calm, composed Mafia boss, who had contentedly held his new daughter's hand at the wedding, was now a terrified, cornered animal, jumping at every shadow and sleeping with a loaded weapon clutched to his chest. He frantically tried to retrace his steps, desperate to find the invisible enemy orchestrating his ruin, completely blind to the fact that the architect of his destruction was the very woman he had confidently dismissed as a naive, broken widow just days prior. The syndicate's violent suspicion had successfully crippled him, expertly setting the stage for Amaris to deliver the final, devastating blow in the light of day. The grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive luxury hotel was a masterclass in opulent deception. Beneath the glittering expanse of imported crystal chandeliers, the highest-ranking members of the international underworld mingled seamlessly with corrupt politicians and oblivious socialites. It was the annual philanthropic gala of the rival syndicate, the very empire Baek Do-hyun had deceitfully married into to secure his unassailable crown. The air was thick with the scent of expensive champagne, rare orchids, and barely concealed lethality. Near the center of the room, Do-hyun stood rigid in a flawless charcoal gray suit, his crisp white pocket square offering a stark contrast to the suffocating panic tightening his chest. Beside him, his heiress wife wore a shimmering blush-pink gown, her warm, radiant smile completely absent tonight as she stared at him with cold, venomous suspicion. The walls of his meticulously constructed paradise were already caving in, the financial hemorrhaging having fatally poisoned his standing with his powerful father-in-law. But the true architect of his destruction had not yet revealed her face. Then, the heavy, gilded doors at the top of the sweeping marble staircase swung open, and the orchestral music seemed to falter. Amaris Caldwell stepped into the cascading light, a lethal vision in the very same elegant emerald green wrap-style dress she had worn the day her world shattered at the wedding. Her voluminous, dark, natural hair framed a face that was no longer locked in an expression of sheer terror, but carved from absolute, unforgiving ice. The dangling teardrop earrings caught the chandelier's light as she descended the stairs with the slow, predatory grace of an apex predator closing in on a trapped kill. The low murmur of the ballroom entirely evaporated, replaced by a tense, heavy silence as the elite crowd parted to make way for the striking, uninvited guest. Do-hyun's glass of scotch slipped from his trembling fingers, shattering against the polished marble floor. The color drained from his face as he stared at the ghost he thought he had successfully manipulated in the gallery hallway, finally realizing the catastrophic depth of his miscalculation. She did not stop until she was standing just inches from him, the emerald silk of her dress brushing against his charcoal trousers. Amaris did not scream, nor did she betray a single ounce of the agonizing grief she had carried for 3 years. Instead, she turned her obsidian gaze directly to the syndicate boss, his terrifying new father-in-law, and the trembling heiress in blush pink. "You've been hunting a phantom draining your accounts," Amaris announced, her voice a smooth, carrying velvet that echoed in the silent hall. "But the thief is standing right beside you." She withdrew a sleek, encrypted hard drive from her clutch and placed it deliberately into the older cartel boss's hand. "My name is Amaris Caldwell. 3 years ago, my husband, Baek Do-hyun, faked his death in a fiery crash, leaving me to face his enemies destitute and alone so he could infiltrate your bloodline. That drive contains the irrefutable proof of his original identity, the millions he embezzled from your operations, and his drafted plans to eventually assassinate your lieutenants." She paused, letting the devastating truth detonate over the room before looking back into Do-hyun's wide, horrified eyes. "I kept your secrets perfectly, Do-hyun, right up until the moment I decided to use them." The absolute finality of her words hung in the chilling silence of the ballroom, heavier than an executioner's blade. Do-hyun's meticulously crafted world imploded in real time. He lunged forward, a frantic, pathetic desperation breaking through his arrogant facade as he reached for Amaris, attempting to silence her, or perhaps beg for the mercy he had so ruthlessly denied her. He never made it halfway. The heavy, brutal hands of the syndicate's elite enforcers clamped down on his shoulders, dragging him violently backward. His new wife, the heiress who had once looked at him with warm, radiant adoration, took a slow, deliberate step away, her eyes completely devoid of warmth. She looked at him not as a husband, but as a parasitic infection that her family was about to violently excise. The powerful cartel boss tightly gripped the encrypted hard drive, his cold, evaluating stare shifting from the cornered, stammering Do-hyun to the brilliantly composed woman in the emerald dress. He gave Amaris a slow, respectful nod, a silent acknowledgement from one apex predator to another. She had done the syndicate a monumental service by exposing the rot at their core, earning her absolute immunity in a room filled with the world's most dangerous people. Amaris did not stay to watch the syndicate drag her former husband into the lightless, subterranean depths of their underworld. She turned her back on Baek Do-hyun's frantic, echoing pleas, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence against the marble floor as she walked back up the grand staircase. Pushing through the gilded doors, she stepped out into the crisp, biting night air of the city. The oppressive weight that had crushed her chest for 3 agonizing years was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, intoxicating lightness. Reaching into her clutch, she retrieved her secure burner phone and checked the encrypted balances she and Elena had finalized just an hour prior. Do-hyun's hidden offshore war chest, the millions of dollars in blood money he had hoarded to fund his paradise, rested securely in untraceable, decentralized crypto wallets she completely controlled. She had not only stripped him of his power, his prestigious new family, and his freedom, but she had taken the very foundation of his treacherous empire, leaving him utterly bankrupt and at the violent mercy of the monsters he had tried to outsmart. A sleek black town car waited silently at the curb, its engine purring in the damp evening mist. Amaris slipped into the plush leather of the back seat, her gaze fixed calmly on the glowing city skyline as the driver pulled away from the curb. She watched the towering glass and steel monuments of Do-hyun's ruined kingdom shrink into the distance, fully aware that he would never see the light of day again. The terrified, naive widow who had wept over a burned-out car wreck on a rainy highway no longer existed, burned away by the fires of her own breathtaking vengeance. She was leaving the city tonight, bound for international borders with a new identity, immense wealth, and a future entirely untethered from the ghosts of her past. Amaris Caldwell leaned back into the shadows, a fierce, triumphant smile touching her lips, completely transformed into a woman who commanded her own fate.